Thank you for using our webinar. As a reminder, we do these live every third Thursday of the month. If you have ideas for a webinar topic, please feel free to contact us and let us know, and we'll do our best to accommodate you. We do have a number of subjects already scheduled, and I invite you to go to our website and look to see what they might be. Today we're going to talk about what I think is a very hot topic in BSA/AML, and that is conducting both a data and model validation. Since the beginning of crime, there's been a need to hide the ill-gotten gains of criminal activities. Early bad guys held their loot in caves. Later, treasure chests provided a means of hiding criminal wealth. However, despite the form that ancient loot took, the goal was and always has been to reduce assets to currency so that can be used in exchange for other goods and services. The need to take illicit assets or hide money and its source is commonly known as money laundering. Criminals of all sorts engage in money laundering and have become exceedingly sophisticated in their pursuit of hiding the sources and uses of the money. Because the bad guys continue to evolve, the history of the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering laws is one of ongoing change, too. The laws that make money laundering illegal can be tracked back to the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. Since that time, there have been 7 major changes in the overall legislation that covers this area. There's going to be a test on these 7 at the end of this presentation. Not really. The first is the Money Laundering Control Act of 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, the Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act of 1992, Money Laundering Suppression Act of 1994, Money Laundering and Financial Crimes Strategy Act of 1998, Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools to Restrict it. That's the Patriot Act of 2001, and the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. So, as you can see, there have been many changes in the law, and these are to keep up with what the bad guys are doing. Today, the expectation of what a full BSA program should include continues to change and evolve. One of the most recent changes has been the expectation that all banks, including community banks, will have AML BSA monitoring software and here's the rub, perform both a data and model validation of this software on an annual basis. Well, where does this come from? It comes from some guidance that was issued by the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Federal Reserve back in 2011. As you can see there, the title of the guidance is Supervisory Guidance on Model Risk Management. When you first look at this guidance, it looks like it deals more with interest rate risk and some of the other software. But when you read the definition of a model, it's clear that BSA/AML monitoring software is also included. The guidance is directed toward the idea that modeling software cannot be a panacea when it comes to compliance. Models can only be effective when they're part of a complete compliance program in any area, and in the area of BSA compliance, this is especially true. The guidance sets out a number of risks. To address the first of these enumerated risks, all banks should perform a data validation. This process is basically exactly how it sounds. The data validation is the process of making sure that the information in your monitoring software is being accurately and completely loaded from your core system. While this portion of the guidance may be the most straightforward, and there are a few points that you need to remember when preparing to perform an appropriate data validation. First of all, the guidance clearly applies to all risks. Many banks we have worked with that use data validation information that is provided by the vendor. However, it's important to remember that this validation will simply tell you what happened to the information that you gave to the vendor. If there are other errors in logic or misunderstandings about what information should be captured, this will not appear in the vendor's validation. Therefore, we recommend that the data validation should be completed by comparing software information to your core data information. Now, it's critical that all types of transaction codes that your bank uses are being properly loaded into and recognized by the software you're using. There are 4 different types of software, 5, that are generally used, and as I'm speaking, the different types should be showing up on the screen. Each bank has its own unique set of transaction codes that have been established to identify transactions that are conducted. The software vendor can't know all the idiosyncrasies of your bank, and it's therefore incumbent upon your compliance staff to ensure that the transaction codes are being properly loaded and recognized by your monitoring software. Many banks and vendors believe that once data validation has been done, there's little need to do another one. If everything checks out and the data is being loaded properly, what's the problem? Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever logged onto your computer and found that everything had changed, even though you did nothing different? BSA software is the same thing. Even though you may not have consciously made changes to the software or the process, things change for various reasons. Because change is constant, it's a best practice to test data validity on a regular basis. Consider this. If you do find a problem, it'll be necessary to go back to the last data validation to determine the extent of the problem. The longer you've waited, the bigger the problem. Now, model validation is not data validation at all. In fact, the guidance from the OCC and the Federal Reserve points out that there's a risk framework in which software should be used. And so for BSA AML monitoring software, the risk framework means that regulators expect banks to know how its software works as well as its blind spots for transactions that may not completely be covered by the way the software operates. The expectations are that your bank will use monitoring software as a tool that is constantly being sharpened and improved. The model validation process is the means to ensure that the software is improving. So remember this when you're using your software. Default settings do not reflect the risk profile of an individual bank and often lead to a large number of alerts. When alerts are generated for transactions that are clearly ordinary or not at all suspicious, the output from the software becomes ineffective as the BSA staff spends hours and hours on superfluous data. The model has to be trained to know the risk profile as a bank and look at data that is outside of that profile. Remember this, that a data validation is not a model validation, but both are required. The data validation tests the accuracy and efficacy of the information in the BSA software. Model validation reviews the effectiveness of the system for using the software. You must be able to say why you are using the settings in your software. And once again, the source of this guidance is listed now on the bottom of the screen. We thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at our next live regulatory briefing.